The invitation had been sitting on our kitchen counter for 2 weeks before my husband Kevin finally agreed we should go. He wasn't much of a party person, never had been, even in the 8 years we'd been married. Kevin was the kind of man who preferred a quiet Friday night on the back porch with a cold beer and the sound of the neighborhood settling into itself. Crowds made him uncomfortable. Small talk drained him. But our friends Patrice and James were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary, and skipping it wasn't really an option. These were the people who had stood beside us at our own wedding. The people who had shown up with lasagna when I had my appendix out, who had sat with Kevin for 3 hours in a hospital waiting room when his mother had her hip replaced. You don't skip that kind of people's party. So on the 3rd Saturday of October, I put on the burgundy dress Kevin always said made my eyes look warmer than usual, and he pulled on the dark blue button-down I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago that he saved for occasions he actually cared about, and we drove the 20 minutes to Patrice and James's Colonial on Elmwood Drive with a bottle of red wine and a card I'd spent 45 minutes picking out. The house was already loud when we arrived. Patrice had always thrown good parties, the kind where the food was real and the music was just loud enough to fill the room without cutting off conversation, and where enough different kinds of people showed up that you always ended up in at least one conversation you hadn't expected to have. Kevin handed off the wine at the door, found himself a beer almost immediately, and settled into the comfortable orbit of James and a couple of their work friends near the fireplace. I kissed him on the cheek and wandered toward the kitchen, where Patrice was refilling a charcuterie board and looking radiant in a green wrap dress. "You look incredible," I told her, and she grabbed both my hands and squealed in a way that was so purely Patrice that I felt immediately, deeply glad Kevin had agreed to come. The evening moved the way good evenings do, in a pleasant, loosely structured way, from one conversation to the next, from the kitchen to the living room to the back deck, where someone had set up a fire pit. I had 2 glasses of wine, which for me is just enough to smooth the edges of social anxiety without crossing into territory I'd regret. Kevin had maybe 3 beers over the course of 4 hours, which for a man his size barely registered. We weren't drunk. That matters, because what happened later has been retold in ways that cast the whole night in a blur of alcohol and poor decision-making, and that's not accurate. We were alert. We were ourselves. The trouble, when I look back at it now, started with Ryan. Ryan was a friend of a friend, one of those people who exist at parties in a particular way, orbiting the edges of other people's social circles without quite belonging to any of them. He was good-looking in an obvious, uncomplicated way. Tall, broad-shouldered, confident in the manner of someone who had been told he was charming, often enough to believe it without questioning it. He'd been introduced to me briefly early in the evening by a mutual acquaintance named Todd, and I had formed no strong impression of him either way. He was fine. Pleasant, even. We'd talked for maybe 10 minutes about nothing in particular. Where he worked, how he knew James, whether I'd seen some television show everyone seemed to be watching. The joke, when it happened, was born out of the specific kind of comfortable silliness that comes from 8 years of marriage and genuine security. Kevin and I had always had that kind of relationship, the kind where you can tease each other, mock each other lightly, play little games without any undercurrent of real insecurity. We weren't possessive people. We weren't jealous in the gnawing, anxious way. We trusted each other in the deep, structural way that isn't even really a daily feeling anymore, just a foundation you stop noticing, because it's always there. It was getting close to 11. A few people had already left. The party had migrated mostly to the living room and the back deck, and there was a smaller, sillier crowd forming near the staircase. James, Kevin, Todd, Patrice's cousin Nina, and a couple of others I knew less well. Ryan had drifted into this group. Someone had started telling stories about the most embarrassing things they'd ever done at parties, and the whole group was loose and laughing, and Kevin had his arm around my shoulders and I was leaning into him. Ryan made some comment. I don't even remember exactly what it was, something self-deprecating about his track record with women at parties, and without really thinking it through, running purely on wine and comfort and the warmth of the room, I turned to Kevin with a deliberately theatrical expression and said, loud enough for the little group to hear, "Well, I'm going upstairs with Ryan. Don't wait up." I was grinning when I said it. Kevin knew I was grinning. The joke was so obviously a joke. The exaggerated tone, the soap opera phrasing, the way I was leaning against my husband while I said it. It's the kind of thing you say to someone you're completely secure with. A little bit of playful absurdity meant to land as a laugh. And for a fraction of a second, it did. James snorted. Nina laughed. Kevin raised an eyebrow in the mock-wounded way he sometimes did when I teased him. But then Ryan laughed too, and his laugh was different. It was just slightly too long, just slightly too pleased with itself, and before the moment could pass, before Kevin could respond with some dry comeback and the whole thing could dissolve back into the general warmth of the evening, Ryan looked at me and said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Yeah? All right then. Lead the way." There was a beat of silence, not a long one, maybe 2 seconds. But in that 2 seconds, several things happened simultaneously. The laughter in the group changed texture, becoming uncertain. Kevin's arm, which had been relaxed and warm around my shoulders, went very still. And I felt, with sudden clarity, that the joke had been picked up and turned into something I hadn't intended, something that required immediate deflation. "I was kidding," I said, still smiling but stepping slightly back toward Kevin, obviously. Ryan shrugged, still wearing that smile. "Sure, but the offer stands. Seriously." He held my gaze for just a moment too long. "You can do better than this guy." He jerked his head toward Kevin when he said it. The way he said it, casual, dismissive, like Kevin was a piece of furniture rather than a person standing 3 feet away, was what changed things. Because up until that moment, this could still have been diffused. An awkward read of a joke, a moment of misplaced confidence, something that gets laughed off and forgotten. But that last line wasn't a misread. It was deliberate. It was a choice. Kevin didn't move immediately. That's one of the things I want people to understand about my husband, because the way the story got retold afterward sometimes painted him as someone who simply exploded. He didn't. Kevin is not an explosive man. He is, in most circumstances, the most contained person in any room, steady in a way that has nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with genuine self-possession. He thought before he acted. He always had. So there was a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, where Kevin simply looked at Ryan. Not with anger exactly, with something more like assessment, like he was deciding what this situation actually was and what it actually required. Then he stepped forward, just slightly, not aggressively, not in a way that invaded anyone's space, just forward so that he was clearly present, clearly in the conversation rather than behind it. "Hey," Kevin said. His voice was even, calm in a way that, if you knew him, was more serious than shouting would have been. "She said she was kidding. That's the end of it." Ryan looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recalibration, an assessing of whether this was a real confrontation or a performative one. He decided, incorrectly, that it was performative. "Relax, man," Ryan said. "It was just—" "I heard what it was," Kevin said, "and I'm telling you it's done." There was a quality to his voice that made the remaining people in the group go very quiet. Not frightened exactly, but attentive in the way you get when something in a room has shifted from social to real. James, who had known Kevin for 15 years, set his drink down on the side table. That small gesture, James quietly putting his glass down, somehow communicated everything about the seriousness of the moment. Ryan, to his credit or his discredit, depending on how you see it, decided to push once more. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the couple of drinks he'd had. Maybe it was simply who he was. He laughed again, that same laugh, the one that was too long and too pleased, and said, "Look, she made a joke. I made a joke. If she's not actually interested, she can say so herself. She doesn't need you speaking for her." And here is the thing that I want to be clear about, because this point matters enormously, and got lost in some of the versions I heard later. Kevin wasn't speaking for me. He knew that. I knew that. The room knew that. Ryan had been told by me that I was joking. What Kevin was doing wasn't overriding my voice. He was responding to a direct slight against himself, to the "you can do better than this guy" comment, to the fact that a man had looked at his wife and decided to persist after a clear rejection. Those are separate things. Kevin was not a man who needed to be protective in the performative, possessive sense. He was a man who had been disrespected to his face and was responding to that disrespect with directness. "She already said so," Kevin said. "You chose not to hear it. I'm making sure you do." And then, because Ryan still had that smile, because he was still performing for some imagined audience that existed only in his head, Kevin did the thing that no one expected. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped closer to Ryan, not threateningly, but close enough to make it personal, and he said, quietly enough that not everyone in the group could hear, "I've been watching you work this room all night. Every woman here has had to navigate around you. That's not charm, that's a problem. And I'm not going to stand here and act like it's funny." Ryan's smile finally, fully faded. What Kevin had done was more disarming and more devastating than a punch would have been. He had named it. Not as a dramatic scene, not as a territorial display, but as a clear-eyed factual statement about Ryan's behavior. Behavior that, when laid out plainly in 8 words, every woman here has had to navigate around you, suddenly made visible something that had been ambient and unspoken all evening. Several people in the group, Nina, definitely. Patrice's friend Courtney, who had arrived after dinner. Todd's girlfriend, whose name I hadn't caught. They all looked up in that particular way that meant recognition. Ryan stood there for a moment. The smile was gone. In its place was something that looked uncomfortably like shame. The particular shame of someone who has been seen doing something they knew, on some level, wasn't right. He left the group. He found his jacket. About 15 minutes later, Todd mentioned that Ryan had gone home. The room didn't immediately return to its previous warmth. That's the thing about moments like that. They don't just snap back. People stood slightly differently, spoke slightly more carefully. James refilled everyone's drinks, which was his way of attempting to reassert normalcy. Patrice appeared from the kitchen, took in the changed atmosphere, and looked at me with a raised eyebrow that asked a whole question. I shook my head slightly. Later. Kevin came back to stand beside me, and I slipped my hand into his, and he squeezed it once. Not dramatically, not making a production of it, just once, the way he did when he wanted me to know he was there. "Are you okay?" he asked very quietly. "Yes," I said, and then, "I'm sorry, that was a stupid joke." He looked at me with an expression I knew well, the one that meant he was about to say something precise. "The joke was fine," he said. "The joke was you, and I knew it was you. That wasn't about the joke." He was right. The joke had been nothing. The joke had been the kind of easy, careless thing you say when you feel completely safe, when trust is so solid it doesn't occur to you to protect it, because why would you? I had handed a piece of our private shorthand, the easy intimacy of 2 people who have spent nearly a decade becoming fluent in each other, to a stranger who hadn't earned it and had chosen to use it poorly. But Kevin was also right that what followed had nothing to do with me. I hadn't created Ryan. I hadn't made him the kind of man who hears "I was joking" and responds with, "The offer still stands." I had given him an opening he should not have taken, and he took it, and then he doubled down. And what Kevin responded to was not my joke, but Ryan's choice. Driving home that night, somewhere around midnight, the heater in the car doing its slow work on the October chill, Kevin said, "You know what the actual wild part of tonight was?" "What?" How normal it felt to him. Ryan. That whole thing felt completely normal to him. He paused, watching the road. The way he kept smiling. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't reading the room wrong. He genuinely thought that was just how you talk to someone else's wife at a party. I thought about that. Until you said what you said. Until I said what I said. Another pause. I don't know if it'll stick. With a person like that, it probably won't. but it needed to be said out loud. It did need to be said out loud. That's the part that stayed with me in the days and weeks after the party. Not the confrontation itself. Confrontations happen. They're uncomfortable. They pass. But the particular quality of Kevin's intervention. He hadn't protected me from Ryan because he thought I needed protection, or because he was staking some territorial claim, or because his ego had been wounded by a flirtatious comment directed at his wife. He had done something quieter, and I think more genuinely valuable. He had refused to allow the behavior to be normalized by silence. Because the thing about Ryan, and about people like Ryan, and there are people like Ryan at more parties than we like to admit, is that they rely on the social pressure of the room to sustain them. They rely on the discomfort of confrontation being higher than the discomfort of letting things slide. They understand, usually correctly, that most people will let most things go, because making a scene feels worse than tolerating the original offense. What Kevin had refused to do was let that calculus work, and he'd done it without making a scene, which is the harder and better version of refusal. I talked to Nina the following week. She called me on a Tuesday evening, ostensibly to thank me for a recipe I'd texted her, but she moved quickly to the night of the party. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about earlier in the evening, before you were even there." She told me that Ryan had approached her twice, once at the drinks table, once on the back deck. Both times she'd been pleasant but unambiguous, and both times he'd continued the conversation past the point where most people would have taken the hint, asking questions, positioning himself physically a little too close, laughing in that way she described, and I recognized it immediately as a little too settled in. "I didn't say anything," she said. "I just kept redirecting, and eventually someone else came over and he drifted away. And I filed it under annoying guy at party and moved on." "I did the same thing," I said, "when I met him. I didn't think anything of it." "But then your husband named it," Nina said, and I thought, that's what it was. That's exactly what it was. He wasn't just being enthusiastic or socially clumsy. He was making a deliberate and consistent choice to push past what women were clearly communicating all evening at this one party, and no one named it until Kevin did. She paused. "It was such a small thing," she said. "In the grand scheme, nobody got hurt. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. It actually mattered." That conversation became, I think, the real lesson of the evening. Not the lesson about trust in marriage, though that was there, and real, and worth sitting with. Not the lesson about thinking before you make a joke at a crowded party, though that was there too. The deeper lesson was about the cost of silence and the strange, outsized power of naming a thing plainly. We protect a lot of behavior by declining to name it. We protect it through politeness, through conflict avoidance, through the reasonable human desire not to be the person who makes a comfortable evening uncomfortable. And the people who rely on that protection understand it. They count on it. Ryan had been counting on it all evening and had had no reason, until the moment Kevin spoke, to believe it wouldn't continue to work. Kevin didn't do anything heroic. He'd be the first to say so, and does say so whenever the story comes up, which it does occasionally, in the way stories do when they've been shared among a group of people who were present. He spoke clearly. He said what was true. And he didn't pretend the thing he was seeing wasn't what it was. It's not complicated. But it's remarkable, I think, how rarely it actually happens. There's a version of this story that centers Kevin as the protective husband who stepped in for his wife. I've heard it told that way, and it bothers me, because it misreads what actually occurred. I didn't need Kevin to defend my honor. My honor was fine. I was managing the situation, as I'd managed dozens of situations like it before, redirecting, de-escalating, applying the small, constant, exhausting labor that women learn to perform in environments where someone has decided to be difficult. What Kevin did wasn't defend me. He addressed something that also involved him, the dismissive, "You can do better than this guy." And in doing so, he made visible something that had been invisible by consensus. That's a different thing. And it's, I think, the more important thing. The marriage lesson, if there is one, is quieter. It's about the particular gift of a partner who knows you well enough to tell the difference between you playing and you being played. Kevin had known instantly, from the tone of my voice, from 8 years of knowing how I moved through the world, that my comment had been theatre. He'd been ready to play along, to raise an eyebrow and shoot back something funny. He hadn't been blindsided by it because we didn't have that kind of fragility between us. What he reacted to wasn't jealousy. It was something more like attentiveness. The specific attentiveness of someone who knows you and watches, not because they're monitoring you, but because they care what's happening to you. That kind of attentiveness is easy to take for granted. I took it for granted, a little, before that night. I took for granted that Kevin would always understand what I meant, that he would always clock the difference between the performance of a thing and the real thing. I took for granted the security that made the joke possible in the first place. I don't take it for granted anymore. Exactly. I don't walk around in a state of conscious gratitude every day. That's not how people work, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of falseness. But I remember now, more often than I used to, that the ease of a good marriage is not actually easy, that it is made carefully, over years, out of choices that compound quietly into something you stop noticing because it's always there. I'm glad Kevin was there that night, not because I needed to be rescued, but because he was himself, steady and clear-eyed and unwilling to pretend that what he was seeing wasn't what it was, and that turned out to be exactly what the moment required. We went back to Patrice and James's house a few months later for a birthday dinner. The house was warm and smelled like the roast James always made, and Kevin found a beer almost immediately and drifted toward the fireplace, and I went to help Patrice in the kitchen, and the evening moved the way good evenings do. Ryan wasn't there. He hadn't been invited. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody needed to.